The artist of today chooses his own style, as close to reality or as far from it as he pleases. But in painting people, the ties of appearance set a boundary. Clifton Pugh gives us an insight into the approach of a modern portrait painter in a series of portraits of his wife, Marlene.
A portrait is a contract between the sitter and the painter. To me, I've got to feel some sort of rapport, some sort of emotional reaction to the sitter. He's got to be sympathetic, he's got to try and work with me. We've both got to try and produce a painting. The emotional reaction that I have to the sitter is going to determine the forms, the colours, even the technique of painting, the way I'll put the paint on, the brush marks. In Marlene, it's been much easier because I understand her much better. And over the period of years, the paintings are all different because of the different emotional reactions we have at that time.
In the first painting of the series, The Muse and Ourselves, completed in 1956, the painter is talking about his family relationship. He shows his wife and children as a unit in themselves. Feeling separated from them by his work as a painter, he has shown himself in different colors and tonal values. His wife, also an artist, is unhappy because the duties of motherhood hold her back from using her creative talents.
In this next painting, Portrait of a Woman, which was done also in 1956, the same sort of feeling was going on, but here I've used Marlene not so much as a portrait of herself, but to say something a bit more about the situation of a woman. In her, I've made her, I feel anyway, the modern woman, a very frustrated one. I've put her in a night situation. Night to me seems to suggest the dreaming stage, the unhappy stage. In fact, it's a woman completely, in a sense, out on a limb, a very unhappy one. There's a big change in this painting from the previous ones, in the colour, in the form, in the whole attitude towards it. I would think it's probably because I've been much more involved in painting the bush around me. So Marlene is starting to take on the colours and forms of the habits that I've acquired in the last 2 years painting. There's a much happier approach in this one. I think also because I've been getting more inspiration from things outside me, as from the bush, this painting is much more objective than the ones before of Marlene. That is, it's more perhaps related to her than just the feelings I have about her.
The portrait Marlene, 1960, painted after a visit to Central Australia, has in its forms and colours something of the pioneering spirit of the outback. Once again, the painter's own experience has affected his approach to his sitter.
I think this is very important in a way in any portrait, because I think portraits have to be we'll say perhaps 40% a self-portrait, the other 60 coming from the sitter. These paintings, of course, of Marlene are done of someone that I know very well. It's a very different circumstance than the one of Archbishop Mannix. That was a commission painting, and I hadn't seen him before. But in this case, he's a man of 99, a very, very strong personality. In a way, he almost painted the picture for me. He was projecting very strongly. That is, he obviously had the image he wanted to be said, and as I didn't know very much about him, but was very impressed with him, and the fact of being a man so old, his character's well laid out in his face, and this would have been a much easier job from my point of view than doing, say, a younger man or a man not quite so positive.
Clifton Pugh's self-portraits, like all his work, have a strongly individual style, one very different from that of the earliest Australian portrait painters. The best known of those working in the early colonial days was not native-born, but an American, Augustus Earle. His group portrait of the Piper family is typical of the period, with its primitive, slightly saccharine charm. The first distinctively Australian school of painting emerged with the work of Tom Roberts and Frederick McCubbin, pupils of the Melbourne National Gallery School. The school's main contribution was in the landscape field, but Roberts in particular showed a new freedom of handling and an insight into character, as in his portrait of fellow artist Arthur Streeton, and of silent Bob Bates. Bates was later used by Roberts as the model for the coachman in his bushranger picture, Bailed Up. Roberts is less comfortable in his commissioned work. His treatment of Sir Henry Parkes is hard and academic. In fact, painting famous people raises a perennial problem for the artist. Should he adopt a weighty, formal style, or should his style remain his own, whether his sitters be famous or not? Sir John Longstaff, in his gaudy portrait of Madame Melba, seems to have swallowed her public image whole. With the poet Banjo Paterson, where his sympathies are engaged, the result is a warm study. The same is true of his portrait of Henry Lawson. Lawson must have been a very sympathetic sitter. He seems to have impressed his mood of gentle melancholy on all who painted him. Shortly after World War I, the National Gallery of New South Wales was bequeathed a sum of money by J.F. Archibald to establish an annual prize for portraiture. Archibald, an ardent nationalist, intended the prize not only as a stimulus to painters, but also as a means of assembling a pantheon of great Australians. At this time, George Lambert, a colourful Sydney artist, was one of the two influences dominating Australian painting. In Lambert's work, the emphasis was on design and construction. The white glove is typical of his flair for the dramatic gesture and the exaggerated pose. The other dominant influence at the time was Melbourne painter Max Meldrum, whose work was based on the principle that painting was pure science and that emphasis should be on tonal realism. The tonal realist carried off the Archibald Prize for most of the 20s and 30s. William Dargie was trained by one of Meldrum's disciples. He has won the Archibald Prize 8 times, and among many commissioned portraits of public figures, he has completed a number of portraits of Her Majesty the Queen. His view of portraiture is that of the professional painter.
Being a professional portrait painter involves the usage of specialized skills against the background, or growing out of, if you like, the general practice and theory of your profession. A portrait painter is an ordinary painter with his background of training, and he's been led fortuitously or by choice along this particular path. And he finds that he acquires those little bits of special knowledge growing out of his experience of difficulties that come up whilst you're painting a picture, because painting a picture is practice as well as theory, and it's only in practice that you get this knowledge of the pitfalls. Among the difficulties that arise and that you get experience of is the limitations that are imposed on you by the length of time people can sit. This, of course, is very irksome to a painter. Left to myself, I'd probably like to have 30, 40, 50 sittings. Instead of that, I have to have a technique which can deal with the problem within 6, 8, 10. One simply must learn to contend with this difficulty, and this is part of the specialization. This is a portrait of Sir Lionel Lindsay, most distinguished Australian artist, and a man of most active mind and very wide interests. Now, I did not set out to find some means of expressing this activity of his mind, because I was concerned with the visible things. I don't pose people. That's how he sat down, and that's how he normally talked to me. This is his natural background, and whether it expressed his personality or not is not for me to say. I'm very indebted to this old chap. He gave me a Spanish proverb which should be borne in mind by every painter. If you turn yourself into a honeypot, the flies will eat you. This is a portrait of my wife. I painted it, I think, when I was about 25. It's obviously a young man's picture because, as you can see, I've been determined to get everything in. I suppose it could be said this sort of painting is now what could be called old-fashioned, but in due time, you know, all painting becomes old-fashioned. And I don't think a painter should consider fashions or times. In due course, all pictures from any period seem to come together, and they're judged, if they survive, on merits which are largely divorced from fashion. And I think we should be more concerned with the present moment, what we're doing, and getting some interest out of it.
The Art Gallery of New South Wales in 1964 honoured William Dobell, a painter of a very different style, with a retrospective exhibition. The power of Dobell's portrait stems from two things: his technical mastery, based on his study of Rembrandt and Goya, and his acute observation. Direct, quizzical, and often deflating, his interest in his sitters is not confined to their appearance and character, but probes their notions of themselves, the front they present to the world. This gives his work its occasional expressionist, satirical air. Dobell's portrait of Joshua Smith won the Archibald Prize in 1943, and in doing so brought his flair for the fantastic into widespread and heated discussion. Fellow artists called it a caricature. A court case followed, and the award was upheld. This is a print of the original, which was destroyed by fire some years later. Only an oil study for the original now remains. Dobell's perception and command place him in a position which even he finds difficult to define.
I have been branded as a modernist, but I think traditional is a better word. I'd like to be taken as an Australian painter, but I don't think there's anything particularly Australian in it. As a matter of fact, it's been criticized as being non-Australian.
In 1948, Dobell won the Archibald Prize a second time with his rich portrait of the artist Margaret Olley.
Margaret at the time was interested in the Edwardian period. She had quite a collection of Edwardian articles and liked to dress at parties in that way, and I thought that was part of her character. It was more picturesque than just a straight-out, conventional, everyday costume.
Perhaps the best-known Dobell portrait of recent years is his study of Dame Mary Gilmore. Poetess, feminist, her pioneering spirit greatly impressed him.
I liked her very much. I thought she had a very strong personality and very sympathetic. She was very obliging. She would sit endlessly for me, and I did quite a few pencil drawings after. I never have the sitter sitting for oil painting. I do pencil drawings, and then I make many little color studies at home from my pencil drawings. And then I choose the one that I feel would make the better picture, and I work from that in combination with my pencil drawings.
Dobell's vision extends beyond sitters of rank and prestige to the ordinary man. Tough, sometimes unpleasant, but never far from the truth, his gift for characterization has enabled him to create an unrivaled gallery of Australian types.
The Billy Boy was a local man from Wanji, where I live. He was the union representative on the job I was working at as a camouflage artist during the war. He was supposed to boil our billies, but went to sleep behind a log and let us boil our own billy. He was a very bad-tempered Glasgow Irishman, and I thought he would come and tear the house to pieces when he saw the picture, but he put his best hat on and he came to Sydney to see the exhibition, and was made quite a fuss of in one of the newspaper offices here. I preferred to choose my own subjects. I avoid commissions as much as possible. Well, there's much more money in it, but people who commission portraits will usually, no matter how genuine they are, they have a false opinion of themselves. I prefer the person that can't afford a portrait and choose my own subject. I don't like meeting important people. I find the average person that you see in the street much more approachable and easier to deal with.
Margaret Olley has been painted by another distinguished Australian, Russell Drysdale. But apart from portraits of his close acquaintances, such as Donald Friend, a fellow artist, most of Drysdale's subjects are not individuals, but types. His painting, The Gatekeeper's Wife, is typical of his approach.
It's rather like this. You see a figure which excites you and interests you, and then you start to paint it, but you're not painting actually the individual. It's really a painting that's made up in your own mind from somebody you've seen. And after a while, painting, or you try and give the character in the painting to the type of person that represents, a sort of archetype of gatekeepers' wives, if you like. The real portrait painter is a man who works solely on portraits, usually, and for commissions. But I've never accepted commissions. I find they're too inhibiting.
Like Henry Lawson, Drysdale has sought to bring down to earth the over-glamorized image of the Australian bush. Reducing imagery to essentials, these paintings convey an uncanny feeling for lonely people in bleak, hostile surroundings.
For one thing, you must remember my environment for years had been the country. There were people I knew. I liked landscape painting. And the introduction of figures into landscapes is sometimes very important. It gives a sense of scale to a landscape. In those days, not so very long ago either, before the war, if it comes to that, drovers were often accompanied by their wives and sometimes their children. I'm talking about the people who drive sheep, not the cattle drivers at the centre, but the drovers of the Riverina. In a way, this picture dates them. But today you find them probably in motor cars who arrive at night, camp, and drive off again and make a camp further on. And they certainly don't carry kerosene tins in the way they used to here. They've probably got transistor radios instead. Maria, I painted her after I painted a picture called Joe the Greek, who was a Greek cafe keeper. And I painted Maria because I thought somehow that she should come into it too. These people who ran these cafes in the country town were the great benefactors in the old days, especially when roads were bad and there were long distances to go. But they were the one place you could always get a feed. Joe the Greek's or Joe's Garden of Dreams Cafe. I think everybody who's ever lived in a country town always has some kind place in his heart for them. Happy Jack, well actually Happy Jack existed, although I painted him from memory. But in a way, Happy Jack is another representative type. He actually comes from the Kimberleys, but in a lot of those areas, which are rather remote places, you'll find these strange men who live extraordinarily lonely lives. And some of them are individuals who are very near the borders of insanity. Happy Jack was one of these odd fellows, but he was a happy man. A lot of the other types you find are not very agreeable chaps sometimes. They're known as death-adder men, the sort of fellows who bite your head off. You speak to them before 12 o'clock, you know. They're odd men, people, I think, sometimes ravaged by loneliness, really. When they do come to any place where people may be, a small township, they often don't talk very easily with other people, but only with those that they're kind, and then they can become quite garrulous. I don't know. I think probably the people one meets, one has known them as they used to be. These memories of them drag up, and somehow they come out in the pictures.
Russell Drysdale is himself the subject of a portrait by the Brisbane painter John Molvig. Joy Roggenkamp is another of the sitters Molvig has drawn from among his friends. Like most painters, he feels that friends supply that special rapport needed to achieve a good portrait.
Well, I've painted Joy about 8 times. She's a very interesting subject. Painting is a sort of abstract thing. You have an idea or feeling about things. It's extremely vague, but you must commit to canvas, which is concrete. It's very difficult to say what you feel about anybody because there are so many facets involved. It would be almost impossible, unless I was a writer and a good one, to put it into words. In this particular case, I did a good many drawings. I do drawings to find out about people, and then perhaps I throw them away and do the thing from memory. While you're doing these drawings, you usually talk to them and discover what their characters, if possible. You must be a sort of psychiatrist, because a portrait is not just a visual image. It's not just the facade of a person, but a person is made up of many, many things. Experience, likes, dislikes, prejudice, all sorts of things, which you must try and convey in a portrait. Of course, you can always do a visual image of them, that's fairly simple, but to do a good portrait, you must understand people. Different people, having different personalities, must be represented in a different way. And I try to create a style that will bring out their personalities in every portrait. Well, Finney is a keeper of a rooming house in Brisbane, and he's quite a character. He keeps a rooming house that caters to all sorts of low life. Well, when you start a portrait, you're looking for something. Now, Finney's a great drinker, sweet sherry, that is. So I started from this basis and worked on. The mask is symbolic. It's a symbol of the mask that everyone wears for the world. Finney doesn't wear this mask as much as most people, but I think he can look at himself fairly objectively. So this is what he's doing. It's very difficult to explain a picture in this manner because it's a manifestation of feeling more than anything else. A manifestation of my feeling towards the sitter or about the sitter.
Like most of his work, Molvig's self-portrait is in his aggressively modern satirical style. A young Sydney artist, Andrew Sibley, has also painted a portrait of Molvig, equally striking and just as much of its time.
I've always considered John Molvig to have a very fiery sort of exterior, a sort of a mixture between a matador and a sort of Don Quixote type of person, but very, very sensitive underneath this facade. His whole figure is clothed in a sort of almost a costume of a matador, so from a extreme sort of discord of reds and yellows through to delicate whites and greens. This is a portrait of John Denison. He's an actor, a playwright. I met in Melbourne, and the first moment that I met him, he seemed to me to sum up completely the theatrical type of person, because I like to paint particular types, and I started off by doing some naturalistic drawings of him as he is, in a typical pose, and the hands, I feel, are very important in a portrait, and I did several drawings of his hands, showing gestures, different types, and then came the problem of working out form in the painting that suited the character of Finlayson. And the fourth drawing is the final version for the painting.
Until recently, all Australian painting was regarded as little more than a provincial expression of British art. But today, the work of Sidney Nolan, Arthur Boyd, and others has established a style recognized as Australian in its own right. Now our portrait painters, too, are coming of age. There are many art schools, such as the National Gallery School in Melbourne, which are encouraging students to work in their own individual style. This fresh approach will help portraiture to hold its own against the many new movements in modern painting. Movements which, some critics say, threaten to reduce portraiture to a dying art. The Melbourne art critic Alan McCulloch denies this.
No, I don't think portrait painting is a dying art, not by any means. Like everything else, it's subject to a process of decline and renewal. Most of the great modern painters have painted very good portraits, but when they have been good portraits, they've always subscribed, in my opinion, to what Baudelaire said. He said that the art of painting portraits was to reveal the inherent drama in every man. Now, when a painter is sufficiently interested in a personality, to be inspired by that personality, and to be able to reveal that inherent drama, then his work has a very good chance of becoming an extremely good portrait. After all, art always reflects the spirit of its own time. And the background of artists, the background, a 20th century background, is an extremely complicated thing and presents the artist with, and the portrait painter in particular, with all sorts of problems which are apparently insoluble. But I don't think that genius ever finds these problems completely insoluble, and that's why I feel that portraiture, like all other art forms, will continue. What form it will take, we don't know. Nobody can say that, but I'm sure that it's not a dying art. It's an art that offers a tremendous challenge, and you will always find strong individuals responding to that kind of challenge.